Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Treadwell podcast, I'll be interviewing Thad McIlroy. Based in San Francisco, Thad is a digital publishing analyst and author and principal of the Future of Publishing. He is a contributing editor to Publishers Weekly, covering digital innovation, artificial intelligence, and publishing startups. He has authored a dozen books and over 500 articles on digital publishing. You can follow him on Twitter/X at Thad McIlroy and check out his website at thefutureofpublishing.com. Thad is the author of the book, The AI Revolution in Book Publishing, a concise guide to navigating artificial intelligence for writers and publishers. The AI Revolution in Book Publishing is the first book to look deep inside artificial intelligence, specifically as it impacts authors and book publishers. The book is concise and direct, so readers feel enabled to join the AI conversation and equipped to make personal and professional choices around the technology. In this interview, we're going to talk about Thad's background and career, his professional interest in the book, and about AI and what it means for writers and publishers and what it might mean in the future. So thank you very much, Thad, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Len. Great to be here.
I usually like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story, but you actually have been a guest on the podcast in the past, so we'll put a link in the show notes and stuff like that so people can hear a little bit about your background, particularly your background in desktop publishing and things like that. But I wanted to ask you now about it's sort of difficult to know where to start with these kinds of things. But why don't we start with talking a little bit about what we mean when we talk about AI now, and it's a little bit about its history and your engagement with AI over the years.
I started looking at AI back in the 80s of all things. And at that point, I was doing a lot of work around publishing automation, automated typesetting, that kind of thing. And what little I knew about AI, I thought, oh, maybe this would have some applicability and could help out the process. It couldn't. Back then, it had no applicability, no availability, no accessibility. It couldn't be done. And AI went into what the so-called AI winter, after that, where the early expectations had been thwarted. And so things, the investors turned away, everyone turned away. And I turned away, of course, too. And AI was in the background, after the 80s, but it wasn't really available or pertinent to anything that publishing was looking at. Around 2015, I began to notice that a number of publishing startups were working with AI technologies again. And the technologies at that time were mostly not, having to do with language per se, a lot of other kind of process automation types of things, machine learning. And so there was some activity that seemed of interest, but again, not a major impact. Then along comes ChatGPT in November 2022, and everything changed.
Yeah, it's really interesting talking about this, from the sort of high level, because people have always used the term AI to mean so many different things. And it's one of those funny things where people who come from the outside of it, who understand themselves to be not specialists, assume that the specialists all have some agreed upon terminology and everything's internally consistent and coherent. And it absolutely isn't. AI.
That's a good point.
Yeah. I mean, AI is, like the people on the inside all don't know what they mean by it either, to be sort of, colorful or comical about it. I mean, some people, they'll talk about general artificial intelligence, where they mean like we're trying to sort of reconstruct what the human mind does. That's what they mean by artificial intelligence. Other people can mean doing things that humans can't do, which is, maybe where the artificial part comes in. If you want to get, philosophical about like, what would be artificial about a human thinking machine? Nothing would be artificial about that. And so that just to give a sort of clue to how confusing all these things can be, and don't feel bad if you don't know, is basically kind of the message that I want to give at the beginning of this interview, and then that you give at the beginning of your book as well.
Yeah, for publishers, that's a particularly important message, because people get insecure and uncertain, and then antsy, and then they can be aggressive and angry because they feel left out of the conversation. And it's like, no, please recognize we don't know what we're talking about either. Kind of saying, yeah, we know enough to be dangerous, maybe a little bit more than that, but it's such a vast area, and there's so much uncertainty and so many things that are not known, and so many things that are unclear. How the LLMs work, no one's 100% sure on that. Yep. So, for people coming in from publishing, I try and settle them down and say, we're gonna get as quickly as we can past the conceptual stuff, past the terminology. As I sometimes put it, it's my definition of AI, it's magic. Just think about magic, how a magician works. That's what AI does.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really great image to bring up. It's something that you do. It's a power that can actually do things that, behind which you don't understand, but you can see the effects of it. And, another thing I wanted to talk about just to set the stage is there's just a weird thing in the world of books and talking about writing and stuff like that, where it's so we sort of like repress actually how technologized we already are, right? So you can get, people who say like, are fans of independent bookstores being like, I'm not going to order a book online. And it's like, how do you think the bookstore orders its books? Do you think they fill out a form and send it through the mail? Like the bookstore, your independent bookstore is ordering all of its books online. And I don't say that to be exasperated. It's like, we really need to, we're all technologized. If you're watching this, like it was recorded on computers, you're watching it on a computing device, it's actually like there's all kinds of interesting psychology one can do about why is it that we kind of try and distance ourselves from this technology that actually is all around us and in many ways improving our lives, and why do we get mad about it?
Yeah, that's such a good point. One of the things we talk about, and you hear in a lot of discussions about AI and publishing, is, hey, folks, you're using it already when you do spell checking, when you do grammar checking, when you shop on Amazon and you're getting the automated recommendations and so on. So it's out there everywhere. And so then, you to be a purist is an unrealistic step. But then they'll say, well, I'm not going to use it, deliberately to write my book. And it's like, okay, that's fine. Don't do that. But other people are starting to use these tools, and they're making great progress with it. And, writing's a competitive industry as well. It's not just, all meritorious. And so, AI is a central tool.
So let's dive into talk about that, from the sort of competitive aspect. I mean, we all, if we're watching this, we all love books and we all love reading and things like that. But, often, it's sort of, people who are familiar with the sort of Spider-Man franchise know who J. Jonah Jameson is. And if you want to think about the book publishing world, you should think about that, not someone sitting in a overstuffed leather chair smoking a pipe. It's J. Jonah Jameson. He's trying to make money. With what came up with the what was it, the FTC and the Penguin Random House potential merger. People are like, why is it called Random House? Because it's random. We don't know what's going to be a hit, but we're in it for the money.
That's a good point.
So let's talk a little bit about that, about competition and how the role that plays. So for example, let's setting aside writing your book using AI. The big book publishing companies have been using AI to decide what books to choose to publish and how to market them, right?
No, I don't think they have. No,
okay.
I really don't think they have.
Okay.
There's a couple of tools that can aid in that quest, but the publishers right now are treating that as kryptonite. They don't want to go near tools like that. The last thing they want is to have anyone perceive that AI is being used in a substantive way in any of their publishing decisions. There was a case to illustrate it, I think is in the book, where a company had a short story contest, and they announced that they were going to use AI to filter the entries, not to reject them, but to decide which ones to prioritize. It was never quite clear exactly how they were going to use it, but they said, we were not going to use it to make an editorial decision or a final decision. We're going to make the process more efficient. And that got out, and 5 hours later, it was shut down. There was such a hue and cry from the authors. And I'm seeing that in the publishers, amongst the publishers and amongst the authors, there's still, this kind of radioactive thing that happens whenever you talk about AI for so many people.
Yeah, that would come from a particular place too, where, it's been known that, when you set out, again, using the term AI, it's all in scare quotes every time we say it, right? But AI for hiring, for example, can be trained on racist data and start making racist filtering decisions. So it's important that people are sort of cognizant of that, I think. But you know what? People are also racist.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it's important. I always try to it might be the theme of what I'm going to be saying in this interview, but there's if you don't like selectivity being arbitrary, welcome to editors.
Absolutely.
There is a
That's where publishing, has this mythology that it wants to create. As you say, it's a random process, which a lot of people will admit. But the mythologizing of the publishing industry has to be, we know how this works. We know how to make the right selections. We know what to do when we've made a selection. And, there is some truth about that in the broader professional sense. But indeed, knowing which book's going to be the next hit, no AI can help you with that. And no one in publishing knows that either.
And is there a concern that people have? So they're sort of like more concerned about at the moment. Publishers are more concerned about public perception of using AI than they are about being left behind by a competitor using it.
I think that's right. And that's one of the things I think is really unfortunate for the publishing industry right now, because here's this remarkable tool. And, Hachette, for example, have publicly declared, we will not use this tool for any creative purpose. And it's like, well, what's a creative purpose? That would include, running a manuscript through ChatGPT and asking it for structural analysis of where there were flaws in the manuscript or inconsistencies. No, we're not going to use it for that. We're going to use it for efficiencies, marketing, And I think for them, it's like, that's not a good decision. But I understand why they have to make it. Because, if you say to the authors, we won't be using it for creative purposes, they can get themselves off the hook. But that's ChatGPT is tremendously creative. That's the thing. It's not, we keep trying to point out to people, it's not a fact engine, it's a creative engine. It's something to talk to about ideas, to exchange ideas with. And, it does a great job of emulating a very smart, person with extensive experience across multiple subject areas. What an opportunity it is to work with a tool like that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. So we're talking specifically here about like large language models, which are, the scare quotes AI. One version of the scare quotes AI is large language models, which are all trained on texts.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that works.
Well, the text, how to start on that one. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's vast amounts, right? Everyone's aware that there are vast amounts, in the billions. They talk even of the trillions in some instances of text. And if you, ingest enough text into machine, let's say, and ask it to just sort of run through that text and through that to analyze how language is constructed and expressed, and also what ideas were in the text. I think it managed to do a tremendous job of replicating language in very specific instances. And along the way, it was able to pull a lot of information. And the result of that is that people talk to ChatGPT as if it's got answers. But what it's actually trying to do is not supply specific answers, but rather to express itself linguistically in a way that's appropriate to the query that's been posed. So if you ask it certain things, it will, and hence the hallucinations, it will say, da, 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 here's the answer to your question, da, 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 da. And it's actually just really postulating in language. It's not going to a database of facts in order to respond.
Yeah, exactly. And so what it's doing is it's maybe perhaps billions, perhaps trillions of texts, and it's basically consumed them. And it's trying to, when you ask it a query, there's all kinds of complex stuff going on like that, including a lot of human kind of input. But it's trying to guess the next letter, basically. Every time
that's how people describe it.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense when you sort of delve into how the language models work. Mm-hmm. What I find curious, and I've yet to hear anyone give a good explanation, if it's just guessing the next letter and just guessing the next word, it would get the facts wrong most of the time, not some of the time. And it gets the facts right in so many instances. And it is, it's factual in its responses on so many instances. So there's some kind of architectural issues about the way these LLMs are built that's not being properly articulated. They know too much to be guessing all the time. If you or I, imagine our conversation where, you say, well, what's your book about? And I have to start going, well, I'll try the letter A, I am, writing, it would never, there's no way that could happen. So there's, and that points to the mystique of AI, right?
Yeah.
Even the architects don't know quite what they build.
Well, that's a curious thing too, right? Because these machines are so complex, and what they're doing is so complex as well. But we've already introduced the word kind of training and text into this conversation, and so this is obviously sort of one of the big controversial points in the world of books and writing is people are concerned about, for example, like, was my copyrighted text used to train this large language model? Should that have been permitted?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the sort of questions like, should I have been compensated for that?
Yeah.
And to what extent should I be compensated for that? What are your thoughts on that? So, I mean, there's a lot like
two issues there that we should look at. One, is there text? Is there book in the database? And that one you can dismiss pretty quickly as almost certainly it wasn't, and we can figure out if it was. There was this one instance where the Meta model, the Facebook model, ingested from one database a few hundred thousand, like 180,000 or something books that it had grabbed off of Smashwords of all things, and so they were mostly romance and this sort of thing. So those books were illegally, brought into that particular language model. I've heard rumors that, the other OpenAI and Google's language models did also call upon a pirate set of texts. But regardless, what the sort of working conclusion is, yes, there is some copyrighted material in there, not nearly as much as you think. But then the issue is still there. Well, if there is copyrighted material in there, should I have been compensated if I am one of the ones whose books did get, ingested into those engines? And that's where it's before the courts, and it's something that's going to take almost certainly years to be resolved. But then authors say, well, to hell with the legality, the morality or ethics of it is I should have been compensated. And and then the large language models say, well, we may have read your book, but we read your book the way a human would read your book. We're not, we didn't put it into the database. We can't spit it out verbatim. So there's no copyright infringements per se. And that's, a complex issue that, again, will go through the courts for months and years, probably for now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I want every author out there to get a payday, by hook or by crook, as it were. But, one of the sort of complexities of this kind of thing is like, it could be that it's the worst writing that deserves the most compensation. Is a curious feature of it, right? Because like, it could be that the way an LLM works, like, it could be that it's like, its quality of output is improved by knowing what not to do.
I'd never thought of it that way.
It's a weird thing that like people don't think about that. They're like, oh, it must be my good quality writing is being exploited by this thing. And it could be like, no, your good quality writing would be the most useless thing possible.
But that's a fun point that you're making. But it also, I think you're pointing to the fact that it's a language model. I mean, it doesn't need to just know how Shakespeare spoke. It needs to know how, everybody speaks in every kind of, from every background, from every education, and every profession. It needs a very robust, large language model. And when you're talking now about literally billions and billions of words, who cares about any one book? When authors think, well, there's going to be some compensation, just try and think through. There's, on Amazon right now, we estimate there's 50 million books that are available through Amazon. And so, if a large language model could get hold of all of those books and ingest them, what would the compensation be per author? A penny? It's a nickel. Authors have it in their minds. I've spoken to one of the licensing startups, and they said, we're going to try for $100 a book. Well, good luck with that. There's no way the finances of that could work.
Well, and even if you got it I'm going into plaintive voice here, but like, even if you got it, what difference would that really make? I find we can go up, there's all kinds of avenues one can go down, but there's something like, one of the things that's being got at with the AI kind of discussion is the sort of possessiveness that people have of their creations, that some people have with respect to their creations. I've encountered people before who are like, their primary concern, even before they've written the word, is someone going to steal my book?
Right.
And it's like, well, what? I don't know what to say. Like, you haven't written the word yet, and you're worried about people stealing it. Like, there's something, maybe investigate this fear of, or desire for dominance that's thwarted by the idea of someone taking something from you. I don't know. But like, it's sort of.
I think a lot of it has to do with creativity. The myth of I call it the myth of creativity, because most things are not creative. But any author who sits down to write anything, whether it's a nonfiction cookbook or whatever, or their memoir, or a novel, a romance, or a mystery, whatever it is, you talk to that author, they're being creative. They're being uniquely creative. They're expressing themselves uniquely, personally, creatively. And I understand what they're saying. Yes, you are creating something. Yes, it is yours. But in terms of the value of it as a creative expression in this world of 50 million other books, I think creativity is, vastly overrated. And the most successful self-published authors are becoming far more mechanistic and recognizing, I do this because I enjoy working with words and expressing myself in words. And, I'm polished, but am I creative? That's not really the point.
Yeah, I mean, that's the concept of creativity and inspiration, for example. Where is it coming from is a deep question that I think people really think about creativity. Like, is it really coming from me? Is there something autonomous? Is it coming from the divine? Is it or from the other side? There's and that's why I bring this up, that like, one of the things that the AI discussion in book publishing is really just a kind of dredging up of these deep questions.
Yes, it is.
And you see people facing them, and they talk about they're facing AI, but they're really facing these deeper issues.
Yeah. And that's where the emotions come from, right? Where the anger and the aggression comes from, because you're fooling around with someone's core self, or so they perceive it. And they've really got to get a much broader perspective. They've got to see it in a far larger context to appreciate what's going on and what the opportunity is.
Well, and it makes us face dark things about ourselves too, right? Like hallucination, for example. Like, talk to me at 11 after a few beers. Like, what's the difference between what's the difference between me and Chat GPT? Let me tell you about the 1994 Montreal Canadiens, et cetera. Like, it's probably me
making stuff up.
I'm probably kind of making stuff up, and that's like, actually, how much of our normal human conversation is actually a version of that is what we're facing.
To come point, when people talk about the hallucinations further, right? They say, AI can be a good assistant, can be a good intern, and then people say, well, it hallucinates, makes all these mistakes, and it's not just about a few beer. If you hire someone into your organization tomorrow and they're young and relatively new, they're going to make mistakes. That's part of what happens. That's part of how they learn. And that's part of why, they're juniors within the firm, that you don't have to pay them as much, et cetera, et cetera. And so, life is full of hallucinations. You don't have to have beer. You do it anyway. You do it naturally.
So let's sort of like maybe pivot to the sort of like, like we're talking about some hard questions, but like, what does the book publishing world look like in 10 years? We've got the million monkeys typing at a million typewriters. Yeah. That exists now. Are there going to be people writing books in 10 years?
I've tried to look at that in a whole essay in the latter part of my book, and it's a great question and a really complicated one to answer. one of the ways I try and structure it in the essay in the book is looking at the strengths and weaknesses of publishing as it is today. The industry has been shrinking, slowly but steadily for a couple of decades now. It's smaller today than it was 20 years ago, but it happened so gradually that the people in publishing tend to downplay that and not recognize the fact that the industry has been, in this slow decline. And that in and of itself might not be as big a deal if there weren't other things that are exploding at the same time that we're declining. And so you look at what's going on in primarily video media, and how much in social media, of course, but much of that delivered via video. And, that has exploded by many, many multiples at the same time that publishing is getting smaller. So where we're going to be in 10 years, I think authors need to get really good with media other than printed media. If I'm doing a book such as I've just done, published with Leanpub, one of the things I'm looking at is how I'm going to express it via video. We can do an interview like this, and I've done a couple of other ones, and that's one way for people to get access to some of the ideas in the book, but they don't actually get the content of the book. And I'm asking myself, should I be doing a series of short videos based on the book? Should I be doing a course through Leanpub or otherwise? Because I need to be able to deliver the content in non-text ways. I'm doing audiobooks, as they can see on the site. I'm trying to do 6 different language audiobooks. So that will be one delivery mechanism. But in terms of, moving forward, people are going to be consuming their media in multiple types. And I think the number one type apparently is going to be video.
So I've got what might be kind of a sort of funny kind of philosophical question, but what happens to people's concepts of what an author is or does when they can actually prompt an AI tool to do things? Like, for example, like I remember just a while ago I was making a sort of demo book, and I sort of put in a sort of prompt which was like, I want to write a fantasy novel about a sort of young peasant man whose farm gets raided by an invading army, and he gets taken captive, and then he sort of fights his way to the top to be a general, and then defeats the evil wizard who's hypnotized the king. And it wrote like a good couple of chapters,
sure,
on that. And yeah. I guess my question is, like, imagine you're 5 and you're being introduced to the world of books and writing now, and you can do that. Like, your parents put you in front of the computer and you can do that. What does that do to people's concept of what writing is?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Over the course of their lives, if someone is like, I'm an author, and it's like, well, so I'm being kind of funny about it, but is that are people going to care about authoring?
But that's such a great question. One of the principal values of being an author is not actually writing the damn thing. It's being the marketer of the damn thing. So, in fiction in particular, but also in a higher level nonfiction, there's a tremendous connection that's made between the author and the reader. And that's something that leads to selling more books. Right? The authors are brands, and you build brands and you market through brands. And so, authors, as we see with some of the thriller writers, right? Not Grisham was the one who has all those other authors who work with him.
Yeah.
So it's his brand, right? It doesn't matter if he wrote the thing. And so they're very connected to him individually. So that aspect of authordom, and you see it in Hollywood with stars and with directors. You see it in music, of course, with the performers, needless to say. Anyway, that aspect of writing is endemic to the industry, right? It would be hard to say to someone, you've just read these 3 great thrillers. They were all written by a machine. Well, I want to get closer to the machine. Yeah, so you raise a good point there. Mm-hmm. I wonder, though, when you're talking about a 5-year-old, kids don't make that kind of connections to authors, right? They connect to the content. They connect to the text. I don't know at what point in our progression as readers we become conscious of the author I think it's maybe sometime in high school where I first started thinking, oh yes, like I remember we had Leonard Cohen in poetry class, and you hear about this mysterious guy and he writes these beautiful things. F. Scott Fitzgerald, the Great Gatsby, and you get intrigued by the creator, but that comes later in the game, and I hadn't really thought through what that is in the progression of the life of a reader at the point that they become conscious of the creator.
Yeah, that's I just regressed to grad school and reading The Death of the Author by Michel Foucault, sort of 30 years ago, when it was already 30 years old or something. I don't know. But and just further to the point that like a lot of what we're facing with this sort of AI and book publishing and writing is just facing fundamental issues with it that we maybe haven't faced up to before. That's a very interesting point about how I'm thinking of myself, like when my dad would read me Sherlock Holmes stories before going to bed, I was thinking about Sherlock Holmes, not Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah.
And it can even be disappointing to learn about the author. I mean, in numerous ways, about who wrote the story and stuff like that. And there's all kinds of important questions. But
I think you raise a really important point about, if the machine, and this is where I think people are very concerned about the use of AI in authoring, is again this sort of inviolate notion of the author. So it's like, I do not want a machine doing this. And yeah, as you point out, they've got to ask themselves a little bit more about why they feel that way and what it means when they say, I don't want a machine to write for me.
Yeah, and I mean, there's you bring this up in your book. I'm looking at a page right now where it's AI for authors, and there's this section of authoring and editing with a bunch of bullet points. And you brought this up before, like we've been using. I mean, set aside AI, we've been using computers to do things with writing for 40 years now. Including spell checking, for example. So if you're okay with spell checking, well, you're already thin end of the wedge. Why don't you use it for copy editing? Really, why not? Why don't you use it for proofreading and stuff like that? There's an interesting point. It's kind of like a lot of this stuff is sort of easy to talk about, really impacts people's lives. But, I think you mentioned in your book that there's like maybe in the United States, 9,500 translated books per year. And so when people get very concerned about what impact is this going to have on jobs for translators, it's like translating is a very expensive, like translating, especially literary works, is a very expensive niche activity. The sort of fact of the matter is that like probably translators, I mean, we know this, are using AI to enhance their own work. It might, and again, this is a, common observation about like new technology, is it might make more work for people, not less. Instead of having 9,500 translations, we might have 95,000 translations.
Yeah, we're certainly
because each of those translators can now do 10 times as many books using AI to assist themselves, for example.
Yeah, clearly there's going to be a huge explosion, just for books alone. I'm doing through Leanpub, 31 languages plus English. And that was, literally impossible pre-ChatGPT. There was just no way that could be done. Neither, logistically, economically. I mean, the machines were not good enough to translate at that level. There's still arguments as to how good they are now, but certainly they're order of magnitude better than the machine translation we had before ChatGPT. And so, this is something that's a gift to the world that Leanpub's actually bringing, to be able to, offer to people around the world your book in their language, and they can, have it in English as well, if they want to, check against the original manuscript. So I think that's an amazing thing. But so then the human translators will say, well, I'm not going to get that work. Well, you were never going to get that work. And so that work didn't exist for you before ChatGPT. And the way I think it's going to work, also for Leanpub, right? You're going to need a QC at some point.
Yeah.
If you expand this program, you're going to need to have freelancers on retainer that you can run these things by, because clearly I'm getting some early feedback on the German and on the French, and there's problems in the translation. If you're trying to do that at commercial scale, you would need a highly skilled translator to come in and clean up the rest of the mess. But instead of having 100 translators trying to break through 75,000 words, you've got a highly skilled translator working to perfect the early work that's been done. And so I'm convinced there will be more work than ever. I'm also convinced it'll be better paid than ever. I'm also convinced it'll be more interesting than ever.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that's very well said. One of the curious things that when we talk about when we get into the discussions of the book publishing world, and we're all kind of insiders in it, a curious thing that's often just left out is actual need for a book. One of our early podcast guests, I think even before you, was someone who's a book publishing consultant, and she told me, she said, and I'm just bringing this up kind of by way of analogy, but she said, where I grew up, if you went to the local bookshop and asked for a book on how to get a divorce, they wouldn't have one. And within 3 days, what you would receive is not a copy of a book on how to get a divorce, but a visit from the local priest. And when people talk about, computers and ordering online and stuff like that, I always think about that. But when I think about the need for a book, if it's not in your language and you can get it translated into your language, like your book has been translated into 31 languages, someone's going to read it and they're going to go, okay, I can't read English, but I can read German. And I can tell you that I know this is an AI translation. I can see it right here, blah, blah, blah. But if they need that book, and they can't read it in the original language, whether it's an imperfect machine-created translation or an imperfect human-created translation, something important and profound has been done when that book has been made available in their language when it wasn't before.
Absolutely. The other thing that I'm thinking of as you're saying that is something I discovered just a couple of weeks ago, and I think I shared with you guys the 11 Labs narration, where you don't have to pre-create the audiobook. It can read your book on the fly, right? And there's a technology that's coming in like gangbusters so quickly, and it's going to completely change the audiobook market. Moving forward, people don't have to wait for the damn audiobook. They'll have a device on their phone that can read to them in their language in real time at very high quality. It's astounding how rapidly this stuff's evolving.
Thad, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to have this conversation with me. I really appreciate it, and I was really looking forward to asking you these questions and talking about all these difficult questions. The book, we didn't really cover a lot of what you actually talk about in the book, kind of deliberately, because we want people to buy it and read it. But the book is a really great introduction to all of the sort of things underlying these interesting questions that we've been asking. The book is The AI Revolution in Book Publishing, a concise guide to navigating artificial intelligence for writers and publishers. I highly recommend it to anyone who's in the industry or interested in breaking into the industry and interested in having a foundation for understanding yourself where things are going to be going in the next 10 years. So thank you very much, Thad, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thank you, Len. Thanks for having me back, and thanks for great questions. Those were some wonderful questions, very provocative.
Thanks.